Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's talk in the René Girard lecture series. My name is Robert Harrison and I chair the Department of French and Italian here at Stanford. The Department of French and Italian is one of the sponsors of this lecture, along with Imitatio, which is a project of the Peter Thiel Foundation, and special thanks also to the French Consulate of San Francisco, which is also co-sponsoring this event. The René Girard lecture series was inaugurated last year, and the purpose is to bring here to Stanford eminent, prominent thinkers who in some way are either directly in dialogue with the thought of René Girard or whose work has significant convergences, whether intended or unintended, with Girard's work, and to assure that for a long time in the future, René Girard's home institution, where he had been a member of my department before he retired for over 30 years, that this thought of René Girard will remain vital and dynamic and permanent here at Stanford. And I'd like to say a few words about the way this series works. I know that our guest speaker today, Roberto Calasso, has already delivered in French the lecture that you'll be hearing tonight in Paris at the Centre Pompidou, if I'm not mistaken. No? And it was the same thing last year when our speaker, Timothy Schneider, came to Stanford. There was also a version in France, and this is the purpose that the lectures take place in both René Girard's home country of France and his adoptive country and institution here at Stanford. I'd like to say a word from my own personal point of view about the importance of René, who I think it was will have been considered very, not too far into the future as one of the great titans of 20th century thought. I've been on record for saying that the person who René reminds me the most of is Heinrich Schliemann, who in the 19th century, rather naively, without a rigorous professional education, left Europe with Homer under his arm and discovered the ancient city of Troy with a little bit of help from some colleagues. But this was a time when Homer was considered mostly to belong to the realm of literature and myth and fiction, but Schliemann had a dogged faith in the truth, historical, geographical, and literal truth of the Homeric texts. And on the basis of those coordinates, he more or less came to the right place. And he did indeed discover the site of the ancient city of Troy, and of course incurred the wrath of many professional archaeologists, especially subsequently, because his methods were, to quote Joseph Conrad, speaking of Kurtz, unsound. He indiscriminately bored through many layers of many different cities, thinking that the Homeric city of Troy was going to be at the very bottom layer, foundation. And although his methods did create a number of losses and compromises in the archaeological record, there is no doubt that he discovered the city of Troy. And likewise, I would say that René is like Schliemann in the sense that he began his career as a literary scholar above all. And unlike many of our colleagues in literature, and I don't include myself in that, René does not believe that literature is merely something to be studied philologically, something to be studied textually, something to be studied aesthetically, but believes that literature is a portal to truth, to real, lived, historical, cultural truth. And with that faith in literature, he makes his big discovery of mimetic desire, which he published in his book on Le Mensonge Romanesque, and then proceeded to make another huge discovery, the way Schliemann discovers Mycenae after Troy, of the sacrificial origins of human cultures and the scapegoat mechanism. All this with a lack of, let's say, professional anthropological credentials, academic credentials. But sometimes you can be wrong in your methods, but there's a difference between truth and correctness. And I believe that René discovered at least two great truths that have to do directly with our human condition. And I know that our guest tonight, Roberto Calasso, who is one of Europe's most prominent intellectuals and writers, is author of several well-known books, and it's part of the protocol of these introductory ceremonies to mention them. So let me mention The Ruins of Kasch, which came out in 1983, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony in 1988. These are the original publications dates. Ka, Stories of the Men and Gods of India, came out in 1996 about Hindu mythology, and he went on to write a book on Kafka called K, and more recently, La Folie Baudelaire, a book about the age of Baudelaire, about the 19th century, and most recently a book called Ardor, which was published in Italian in 2010, will be coming out this year in 2014. And he's a very appropriate person to invite for the René Girard lecture series, because he has been in a long, ongoing dialogue with René, directly and also indirectly, and has found in René's work a number of convergences with his own rethinking, especially of the role that sacrifice plays in mythology and in cultural origins. Now, there are ways in which their thinking comes together. There's also ways in which I believe Roberto is in diverges as well from some of René's theses. I know that Mr. Calasso has been on record for saying that René Girard belongs to this tradition of 20th century thought that really begins with Friedrich Nietzsche, where the emphasis is on demasking, demythologizing, and demystifying, and that René's work has very consistently tried to demask, demythologize, and demystify what we read, especially in ancient myths or in tragedies, in order to uncover what he, alluding to St. Paul's, like that things hidden since the foundation of the world. And Roberto Calasso has been on record by saying it's not enough anymore nowadays just to demask, demythologize, and demystify. Now the real challenge is to understand what is a mask, or what is myth, and to understand what is a mystery. And I believe that in tonight's lecture, called The Last Superstition, we are going to hear our eminent speaker think further along these lines. So I'd like to welcome Roberto Calasso here to Stanford.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall I speak from here?
Yes, but you also have a mic on your...
Yeah. Good evening. First of all, I would like to say how happy I am of being here speaking to you, as invited by the Imitatio Foundation, and in connection, as you know, with René Girard, so one of the great minds of our age, and a mind with whom I have been in touch since many, many years. And you will see from what I'm going to read to you how many connections and close connections there are among between the things I'm talking about and his work. And finally, I'm very glad of having had the honor of being introduced by nobody less than Robert Harrison. So, what I'm going to read to you is called The Last Superstition, and you're going to see what it's all about very soon. At a distance of almost 120 years after Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss' essay sur la nature et la fonction du sacrifice, we might ask what is left of sacrifice. Several fundamental works have appeared in the meantime, and an impressive quantity of material and studies has accumulated. Are we able, therefore, to say that Hubert and Mauss' ideas have been confirmed, refuted, abandoned, corroborated? Can we say we have moved on? In what direction? And can we recognize a certain general character that has left its mark on all these studies, at least in academic circles? If Hubert and Mauss' study can be regarded as a terminus a quo, we might consider the collection of essays in Greek and Roman animal sacrifice, which appeared in 2012, edited by Christopher Faraone and F.S. Naden, as the terminus ad quem, providing an exemplary assessment of the state of the art in the academic world with regard to the phenomenon in question. I will try to work back in time, starting here from this book, in which from the introduction by the editors, it is emphasized in order to clear the field of any unwarranted intrusions, that so far as blood sacrifice is concerned, the last 40 years have been dominated by two books, Homo Necans, 1972 by Walter Burkert, and La Cuisine du Sacrifice, 1879, by Marcel Detienne and Jean-Pierre Vernant, to which Fritz Graf then adds La Violence et le Sacré, 1972, by René Girard. Though he's kept rather in the background, since the scholarly status of the author is not as impeccable as the other academics. Girard, after all, involved himself in literature, no less. It being 2012, Faraone and Naden make it clear straight away that since, by definition, it is the destiny of the sciences, including human sciences, to progress, it remains to be seen just how much of those books still stand up. But first of all, what do the vastly different works of Burkert, Girard, and Etienne Vernant have in common? According to Fritz Graf, the fact of being three great theories. And this is essential if one wishes to demonstrate, as is the declared intention in the book in question, that great theories are out, a remnant of the past, to be studied perhaps, like any other phenomenon, as a social and cultural fact, but inadequate if one wishes to describe sacrifice, a word which in itself is then placed in doubt. This is clarified at the end of Faraone and Hayden's introduction, where they seek to emphasize what the animus of the whole volume is, to show that, I quote, 40 years after the publication of Homo Necans, the notion of sacrifice, and here indeed the authors place the word sacrifice in inverted commas, like a corpus delicti, is a category of the thought of yesterday. End of quotation. A ominous and disturbing phrase, which brings various consequences. First of all, that sacrifice as such is no longer a serious subject for research, either now or in the future, but belongs, if at all, to that lesser branch of studies concerned with the history of a particular discipline. Thus, with a single stroke, and on the basis of studies published over the past 40 years, the authors reject a category of thought that has survived for several millennia, with an impressive constancy of themes and language, not just in the classical world, but also, if we wish to go back to the traditions that form the mainstay for Hubert and Moses' study, in the Vedic and biblical texts. In other words, the academic world seems to regard itself in the year 2012 as being too sophisticated and enlightened to be content with what humanity has ineptly accumulated through time immemorial and in the most disparate social and geographical settings. And yet, there is nothing new about this attitude. During a conference in Stanford, way back in 1987, a leading figure in anthropology, Jonathan Z. Smith, spoke with formidable candor the following words that I quote: "I know of no ethnographic monograph published in the last 20 years in which the term sacrifice appears in the index. My conclusion is that there is no sacrifice until we invent it. We imagine it and then go out and find it." End of quotation. Words of remarkable superciliousness, but it seems most ironic and emblematic that just 5 years before the Stanford conference, Herta Krieg's magnificent study on the ritual of setting up the Vedic sacrificial fires was published, a book of almost 700 pages with an index of entries relating specifically to sacrifice that takes up 3 columns. But perhaps her book didn't belong to the category of ethnographic monographs. The impatient attitude of J.Z. Smith towards sacrifice, which he regards as spurious and outdated, as well as baseless, might seem idiosyncratic and isolated. But the contrary is true. This very attitude has found a central place among the academic community. Faraone and Naden's book is evidence of this, and even more, a huge collective work which has been published in recent years very near here by the Getty Center, the Thesaurus Cultus et Ritum Antiquorum, where dozens of very well-known scholars have produced a very really precious work based exactly on this sort of attitude. So it's more than a book. It's a general attitude. And a new implication is now gradually creeping in. Once it has been confidently established that, I quote, "the period has gone in which it was believed that a theory of sacrifice could be elaborated that encompassed all millennia and all civilizations." This is the opening sentence of the important volume of the Fondation Art on sacrifice. It is possible to take the first steps in that young discipline which is the anthropology of the anthropologist. The first and hitherto unsurpassed experiment in this discipline came from Wittgenstein's remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough, where Wittgenstein treated Fraser in the same way that Fraser treated his primitives, observing his behavior, his forced reactions, his implicit meanings, his blind spots, his Victorian susceptibilities, in just the same way as an anthropologist would have recorded in the field the actions of a medicine man. It is a difficult and delicate path where Wittgenstein's clairvoyance did not produce much of a result. But now, in the academic world, there is a tendency to use the personality of scholars in making judgments about their work. In Faraone and Naden's book, for example, they reveal their true colors right from the start with a certain brutality. The two authors write, I quote, "Burckert's theme of violence goes back to the French reactionary, Joseph de Maistre, and the French school's theme of commensal solidarity goes back to Durkheim and the Enlightenment. End of quotation. As for Girard, according to Fritz Graf, it would be enough to say that, I quote, he generalizes the pessimistic aspects of Freud's anthropology. End of quotation. Spoken in the indicative, as matters of fact, and with such a tone of certainty, these judgments have something inadvertently comic about them, especially if one thinks about the embarrassment they might cause Burckhardt in Germany, where Joseph de Maistre is a name that is either scorned or dismissed, whereas Burckhardt himself is highly respected as an authority on classical studies. The following lines provide an even better example of unintentional humor, where it is recalled that, I quote, both Girard and Burckhardt could be seen as reacting to their personal experience of World War II. Both were growing up in war-torn countries, Girard in southern France, Burckhardt in southern Germany. End of quotation. That this observation has a heuristic value of next to zero, insofar as it is applicable to many millions of people, need hardly be stressed. Nevertheless, it is an approach shared by at least one other author in the book, Bruce Lincoln, who traces Burckhardt's theory back to, I quote, post-war German angst, and that of Vernon and Etienne to, I quote, perennial French joie de vivre, about which I have some doubts. Anyway, I wish to talk, however, not about this aspect, but about the general attitude of rejecting great theories, those remnants of a more naive and unsophisticated age. In the same way that many people who flaunt their rejection of politics are at the same time making a political statement, and of a fairly virulent kind, the anthropologists of today who treat great theories with contempt and ill-concealed scorn are at the same moment setting up another great theory. But what kind of theory? To try to understand this, I am prompted by a sharp observation made by Yash Elsner, which can be read in the same collection edited by Faraone and Naden, and I quote it. The fundamental problem, it seems to me, is that the current communist opinion on blood sacrifice, although presented as historical fact, is really a theological assumption, positing a form of religion rooted in sacrificial exchange between gods and men, which results in a material benefit in the provision of meat, with the banquet always given as the final end of the sacrificial process. End of quotation. Although apparently commonsensical, this vision of the sacrifice is just as incongruous as that 19th century vision that explained mythologies in meteorological terms, such as the vagaries of rain clouds, storms, drought, and bolts of lightning. But what is interesting here is not the scant speculative substance of this communist opinion on sacrifice, as much as its hidden origins, which consist in what I would like to describe as the superstition of society, where the word society is to be understood as the very object of the superstition, in the same way as one talks of the superstition of black cats. At this point, we must go much further back and widen the perspective, since the question concerns not just anthropology, but our world as a whole. In fact, why should we be surprised? If the Catholic Church now resembles nothing more than a gigantic social help agency, then why should a simple branch of academic activity, such as anthropology, feel any hesitation about the idea of regarding society as the last horizon of thought. The 20th century saw the crystallization of a far-reaching process which has affected everything that goes under the label religious. Secular society, with no forewarning, has become the ultimate frame of reference for all meaning, as if its shape corresponded to the physiology of any community whatsoever, and meaning had to be sought only in society itself. This can assume the most disparate political and economic forms, capitalistic or socialistic, democratic or dictatorial, protectionist or free trading, military or sectarian, all to be considered in each case as mere variants of a single entity, society itself. It is as though the imagination, after thousands of years, had been deprived of its capacity to look beyond society in search of something that gives meaning to what is happening within society. It is an extremely bold step, which promises a remarkable psychic relief, but which does not last long. Living beyond good and evil is something that meets invincible resistance. To produce, or at least to encourage, that relief is a key characteristic of democracy, but it does not manage to keep it going. Compared to all other regimes, democracy is not a specific thought, but a series of procedures that assert themselves as capable of incorporating any kind of thought, except for that which seeks to overturn democracy itself. And this is its most vulnerable point, as was demonstrated in Germany in January 1933. Secular society thus showed itself to be deft and resourceful in reabsorbing within it those same powers wrapped up in disguise, which it had only just expelled. Theology ended up becoming politics, while theology itself was relegated to the universities. But the process applies at all levels. Without the thrill of the numinous, society seems to refuse to exist, while the numinous itself is confined to academic settings. Unable then to nominate that which it worships in line with the rules of a tradition, society seems condemned to a new and subtle superstition, the superstition of itself, the most difficult to detect and to dispel. The worst disasters have always, therefore, occurred when secular societies have sought to become organic, a recurrent aspiration for all societies that develop the cult of themselves, always with the best intentions. In this, Marx and Rousseau, but also Hitler and Lenin, and also a liberal like Henri de Saint-Simon, have found a fleeting agreement. Organic is fine for everybody. No one is tempted to suggest that the deplored atomization of society may also be a form of self-defense from worse evils. In an atomized society, it is easier to pass unobserved. No one expects the secret police to knock on the door at 4 in the morning. All of this has happened as the result of a long, tortuous process of evolution that has never been interrupted, even though it might not always have seemed like that. If, in obviously arbitrary manner, and for purely dramatic considerations, we had to decide a starting point for this process, no image would be more fitting than that of Sparta, as Jakob Burckhardt has described it, condensing the point into few words with his usual sobriety. I quote from Burckhardt: "Power can have a great mission on earth, for perhaps it is only on power on a world protected by power that superior civilizations can develop. But the power of Sparta seems to have come into being almost entirely for itself and for its own self-assertion. And its constant pathos was the enslavement of subject people and the extension of its dominion as an end unto itself. End of quotation. That these words of Burckhardt have a particular relevance and can be applied not only to Sparta but to recent history and what is happening today is borne out by a curious event in publishing. In 1940, the Deutsche Buchgemeinschaft produced a single-volume edition of Burckhardt's Griechische Kulturgeschichte with an introductory note signed the publisher, which warned, and I quote, "The excessive amounts of technical information, notes, references to sources, as well as certain repetitions and details of interest only to scholars have been eliminated. This has made the work much more readable." End of quotation. Well, having arrived at page 50, the reader would have found a whole paragraph cut out, and it was precisely the paragraph that ended with the words I have just quoted. But it is interesting also to read the previous lines, which had likewise been cut out. They are the following. It has already been stated how generally high is the cost of founding a city, but the founding of Sparta in particular was paid at an extremely high price by the people subjugated. They were given the choice of all forms of slavery, annihilation, deportation. End of quotation. And Burckhardt concluded that even if a social organization of this kind has a magnificence of its own, one couldn't avoid considering it, he says, without any feeling of sympathy. For a German publisher loyal to the regime, and all by then were loyal to the regime, it was intolerable for certain facts to be set out with that inflexible precision and without any feeling of sympathy, as Burckhardt was doing. With regard to the secular society, we might ask whether it is a society that believes in something apart from itself, or whether it has reached that high degree of wisdom in which one renounces belief, but limits oneself to observing, studying, understanding, in an indefinite and unforeseeable progression. Now, this condition, which demands sobriety and concentration, doesn't seem to correspond to what happens every day in this immense secular society that now extends over every continent and is continually wrecked by unruliness from various causes. Unruliness that recalls what happened during the times of religious wars. These, however, were based on conflicts between beliefs. Invisible armies of theologies and liturgies battled alongside terrestrial armies. Today, it would be impossible to detect such armies, if for no other reason than the remarkable narrow-mindedness of these theologies as such, and for their obvious role as pretexts for an action that is political and often particularly violent. The object of society's conflicts is no longer something that stands beyond and above it, but it is society itself, which is first and foremost a vast experimental surface, a laboratory where opposing forces each attempt to take over control of the experiments. This picture should already be enough to recognize the unique character of secular society. Every ethnographer from the positivist school knew that the hundreds of societies catalogued by his discipline had at least one feature in common, that of believing in powers and entities external to society itself, invisible, self-sufficient, and which affected the life of everyone. But secular society declares that it can live without any of this. And from here on, I will refer to it as the experimental society, thus isolating its peculiar character. But when and how did this singular configuration begin to take shape? Though it is true that its earliest sign can be fixed, each time with good arguments, over a period ranging from between the Paleolithic Age and the French Revolution, there is always a moment of crystallization in which the final shape becomes apparent. And in this case, it would be identifiable in those years that we might describe as the period of Bouvard and Pécuchet. These two dauntless innovators, misunderstood even now, were the first total experimenters. There is no area of human activity that remained close to them, and their investigation left indelible traces in every direction, whether it was gardening or astrophysics. Their purpose was to prepare the ground for every future experiment, which had, however, to be based on a sort of all-encompassing encyclopedia. In them, we can find the seed of what would one day be called the Internet. But if Bouvard and Pécuchet can lay claim to the title of heroic founders of the experimental society, there is always one book that guides doctrine, like the letters of St. Paul for Christianity, Stalin's short history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for Sovietism, or Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams for psychoanalysis. In the case of anthropology, it was Les Formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse, which Durkheim published in 1912. By a curious paradox, Durkheim's book was the mirror image of the essay that his nephew, Marcel Mauss, had published 13 years earlier. Mauss and Hubert had written on the nature and function of sacrifice, and Mauss, as a Vedic seer in disguise, sought above all to outline the essential features of the nature of the sacrifice, while not disregarding its social function. Mauss wanted to discover what sacrifice is, what dangers it carries, with what kind of things it establishes contact. Nothing less, indeed, than a great theory. Durkheim, on the other hand, was only interested in function, that peculiar phenomenon for which abstruse and frenzied ceremonies served to maintain the balance and cohesion of a society, indeed of any society whatsoever. Durkheim's path proved successful and remains an undisputed foundation today. It is no surprise that a scholar like R.N. Bella still declares himself to be profoundly Durkheimian, and such a statement is still in line with mainstream anthropology. Moreover, there is something obvious about it, like a high school teacher describing himself as profoundly Newtonian. Indeed, anthropology today, whatever its methods and whichever school, is either functionalist or it's not. This is a common, universally accepted ground of thought. But could it be otherwise? Anthropology as a study of society can only be the locus electionis where that supreme superstition, which is society itself, is acted out. The basis for the superstition of society is expounded in Durkheim's masterwork with formidable candor, unparalleled lucidity, and without any fear of taking things to their ultimate conclusions. Durkheim was well aware that in his theory, no conceptual dividing line could be drawn, on the one hand between the Arunta, who celebrate the rites of the Wichety grub, representing the movements of the animal when leaving its chrysalis and taking its first flight, and, on the other hand, the austere frock-coated officials around him, who were praising the wonders of progress and science. Each of them were branches of a single dense tree, Both cases involved deliria, if we wish to use the word that Durkheim considered to be most appropriate. But they were eminently useful deliria, since it was only thanks to them that social cohesion was assured among Arunta tribesmen as well as in France of the Third Republic. And Durkheim abandoned himself at this point to tones of astringent eloquence. I quote from him: "In summing up, then, we must say that society is not at all the logical or illogical, incoherent and fantastic being which it has too often been considered. Quite on the contrary, the collective consciousness is the highest form of the psychic life, since it is a consciousness of the consciousness, being placed outside of and above individual and local contingencies. It sees things only in their permanent and essential aspects, which it crystallizes into communicable ideas." End of quotation. No, I'm sorry, it goes on. At the same time that it sees from above society, it sees further at every moment of time. It embraces all known reality. That is why it alone can furnish the mind with the molds which are applicable to the totality of things and which make it possible to think of them. This is the real end of the quotation. One might think that the person speaking is a pre-Socratic who is referring to Logos, and yet he is a founder of that dismal science called sociology. But there is always a founder who precedes the founder. And Durkheim himself described Saint-Simon as a founder of sociology. What did they have in common? They didn't just study and analyze something that became known as a society. They were the first priests, more clear-sighted and consequential than those others who stopped halfway, of a new cult, the cult of the glorified society. Once upon a time, it was enough to glorify the emperor in order to guarantee social cohesion. This was now no longer the case. Society itself had to be glorified, and cohesion became the divine substance circulating around its body. Durkheim was not worried about criticizing or demonstrating the non-existence of the divine object that religious men claimed they turned to. On the contrary, with paternal solicitude, he was reassuring that object exists, but there is no need to call it with names of gods or of one God. That object is society itself. And he writes, it is the same for its members, society, as a God is for his followers. The ideal type of anthropologist or ancient historian of today is characterized, as Durkheim had hoped, by a distinct lack of interest in those entities whom the officials claim to be the recipients of the sacrifice. Those entities may be gods, demons, spirits, powers, ancestors. Whatever they are, it is assumed that since they don't exist, the fact of turning to them is basically no different to that of talking to a wardrobe. What is actually said to that wardrobe is regarded as being more or less irrelevant, whereas meticulous attention is given to the economic and social reasons that may have induced that behavior. And the preferred solution will be that of anyone who succeeds in providing a detailed description of the homeostatic function that such behavior, aberrant in itself, has within a particular society. There is a lone voice in the 20th century that has recognized with clarity and inflexibility the process that has led society to become the principal and most powerful of superstitions at work today, that of Simone Weil. Basing herself on the passage in Plato's Republic that refers to the big animal, Weil circumscribes with luminous words the phenomenon by which the social, she says, imitates the religious element to the extent of being confounded with it, if one is not helped by supernatural discernment. End of quotation. A discernment that puts reasoning severely to the test, as Weil herself suggests in a comment in brackets. I quote, "This mystery creates an apparent relationship between the social and the supernatural, and excuses the Durkheim up to a certain point." End of quotation. That relationship is an understandable and fatal mistake if it is true, as Weil writes elsewhere, that, I quote, "under various aspects, the social is the only idol." End of quotation. A question then inevitably arises. How can someone today escape from this variant of black magic? How can someone in a secular society trained to ignore the invisible go back to recognizing it? In what form? What will happen to him if he doesn't want to stick to one belief, as happens in the pitiful case of Western sects who describe themselves as Hindu or Buddhist or Shiite or generically shamanic? A ludicrous game that is just one of the various opportunities offered by secular society and branded with its seal. The availability of and access to all the beliefs of the past is one of those characteristics of the era I once called post-historic. But if we exclude that inevitably parodistic path, what other possibility remains? Does the anonymous secular individual have to be content with the cancellation of the invisible, which has now become the precondition of communal life? This is a watershed. If the essential factor is not belief, but knowledge, as every gnosis presupposes, it will be a matter of opening a way into obscurity, using whatever means, in a sort of continual bricolage of knowledge, without any certainty about where to start or any concern about the ultimate destination. This is the condition, both wretched and exalting, faced by those today who belong to no religious denomination, but who at the same time refuse to accept the religion, or more precisely, the superstition of society. It is a difficult path, which has no name, no points of reference, apart from those that are coded and are strictly personal. But it is also a path along which one encounters the unexpected assistance of kindred voices, as in a clandestine constellation. I don't believe we can expect any more in the fraction of time in which we live. And yet, if we look carefully, that is an enormous amount. And it is a great game, which not so few have practiced over the centuries, without declaring it, and which now should have the audacity to show itself in full light. Since I have already referred to Wittgenstein's remarks on the Golden Bough, I would like to close with some words that are to be found there. I quote from Wittgenstein: "One could almost say that man is a ceremonial animal." Thank you. Shall I sit there?
So we have time for question and discussion, and I also would like to remind you that outside there are a number of books by Mr. Calasso that are up for sale, and he would be happy to sign them as well. So now we can open the floor to questions and comments. What's that? Oh, that's right. So if you're going to ask a question, could you come up and speak from one of the two microphones? Yeah. So let's see. Why don't you start and then we'll go to you.
Thanks. Thank you. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you, is there a difference between the moral principles that a god gives to the followers of a god? Is there a difference between those moral principles and the moral principles that the superstition of society gives to society?
Well, I think it's not so much a question of moral principles. That would be too much. For society, it's enough to give rules for functioning. It's essentially functional. So that doesn't need much. I mean, moral is just a cover, as we say. And so it has not much to do with what may be the religious precepts in a faith, whatever it be. No, society is much more practical. And the rules are not exactly the rules that you find in codes. They are sort of unconscious rules which determine the way in which life should go on. And so I would keep moral here, as in many other cases, out of it.
Mr. Calasso, thank you so much for speaking to us. I had a question about when you mentioned experimental society and secularism as this theme that's present in the Western world. I think it exists as a spectrum and not a sort of binary decision. Because if you look at like some Western societies, such as like France, maybe there's like an effort to make sure that religion stays out of public life. But in many other countries, even in the Western world, religion is very much a part of public life. And so when you talk about the societal Leviathan, like, you know, it sounds like, you know, it's more like society is God. But if you look at, like, example, this country was based on Locke's ideas of, like, how a society should be made. And out of that, I think, like, religion or belief or superstition can still coexist outside of the boundaries of society. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I have got what you ask.
Do you think societies are either secular or not, or even when they're secular, there's a spectrum that lies?
Of course there is a spectrum, and every society is different from the one which is near. But one point is clear, that the world, for the first time, is covered by a sort of entity, which is that entity which makes that airports in all parts of the world work more or less in the same way. And that is the way of the secular societies. And of course, if you go from the French airport to the cities, or from a German airport to the cities, you find totally different things. But behind that, there is a structure which is common to all of these societies. And of course, there are very large islands of theocratic, or whatever you can call them, societies which are enemies of the secular society. But there are islands, rather large islands, in the middle of a texture which is much bigger.
Hi, thank you. I was struck by something you said early in the lecture about how without the thrill of the numinous, society ceases to exist, and that the numinous had been somehow confined to academia. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Are you saying that the superstition of society is a way of keeping a simulacrum of the numinous, sort of alive? Or are you saying that the numinous sort of slowly does dissipate, and with it society inevitably dissipates as well?
Well, I'm afraid I had to write a whole book about this point. And that was more than 30 years ago, the Ruin of Kasch. The Ruin of Kasch is based exactly on this mysterious phenomenon, for which, according to which, I mean, what we call secular society cannot go on in secular terms. It has to absorb something else to which it is not capable of giving names, but which can be called the numerous or whatever belonged to the previous era. So that's why politics becomes a sort of clandestine theology. And it is a very dangerous process which creates the most dreadful confusions. All the totalitarian societies of the 20th centuries were based on that, exactly on that. And they killed a certain amount of people. And because they needed to be numinous. And at the same time, they put the category out of themselves. They couldn't mention it. And that is a tragic phenomenon. And it is still on. It is still on today in different forms. But I wouldn't say that democratic societies are sort of safe in relation to this phenomenon. They suffer from it in a different way, but in a way which can be dangerous as well. So it is a big thing. And, the book I'm referring to, The Ruin of Kasch, starts with a sort of master of ceremonies, who is the French diplomat and politician, Talleyrand, who guides the readers through a series of salons. And the salons are bloody salons, most of them, because they start in the Ancien Regime, then you have the French Revolution, then you have a series of other things up to now. And I think at page 5 or 6 of that book, I have to talk about Pol Pot, for instance, because they belong to the same story. And one doesn't understand what happened in the years when Talleyrand was a young man and of one of the greatest French aristocratic families, and his death, which is already in the time of Louis Philippe, so the time of the bourgeois. If one doesn't understand what happened in that succession of regime, in a way, one doesn't understand what happens today, because we are reenacting the same story, and sometimes in even more bloody way.
Sir, over here, that's other side. I must admit, I don't understand the difference between the way religion in older times influenced the behavior of society, and the way whatever superstitions we have now, whatever their origin, influences society today. I don't see this break. I mean, we have superstitions today which govern our policies. We have fallacies and it's, to me, the evolution of society is the evolution of technology and science. It is the understanding of the brain. You look to neuroscience to understand where the origin of our superstitions, because you can find neurological origins of going back to primates, of all kinds of superstitious behaviors. To ignore the evolution of science and technology and analysis of the behavior of society, it just seems to me folly. you mentioned the example of airports, that airports, we look at airports and things are normalized worldwide. You go to one airport, you go to another, it's all, they are run the same. What if you go back to shipping and in centuries ago? The nature of shipping, or the nature of communication during those times was uniform as well, despite different religions and different superstitions. I just don't understand the kind of break you're talking about, and the fact that you don't acknowledge that gradually we understand the origins of human and societal behavior in essentially an understanding of the brain.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I don't believe in that. I don't believe we are gradually understanding anything.
You believe in science?
No, it's ridiculous to believe in science. One practices science. It's different.
The legitimacy of
No, you were talking about neuroscience. That's a very good example. Since, well, it's rather recent, 20, 25, 30 years, everything has become neuro-something. We are waiting for having neurology, because neurology is not enough. We must have something before that. And if you look at the results of this huge effort, which has been done with billions spent on these things in these 30 years, the result is next to zero. I'm not saying that myself. Some other people have said that, who are rather well-known scientists, like McGinn, like Searle, a few others with rather well-known names. But if you, let me finish, if you open one of the major Upanishads, and you see what they are talking about, which is the essential word, which is consciousness. This consciousness that science for many, many years considered not to be a scientific subject. You have to remember that. And that now is the basis of hundreds of volumes with not much result. And if you compare that, if you take one of the major books on this field of today, and you open, I don't know, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Chandogya Upanishad, well, which book gives you more on what consciousness may be? On my side, I have no doubts. At the same time, I am full of admiration for certain scientists. I give you an example. It was a remarkable book, terribly biased, but highly remarkable, which was written by an American scholar some years ago. That was a book by Julian Jaynes, The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. That, well, exactly, but he was a thinker. And yeah, he was a thinker, and he tried to get in that direction. Of course, it's very naive for certain things, but he managed to get to some essential point. The fact that, for instance, the idea of the I that we have in our mind and which is dominant in our society is simply wrong. There is no I. There are at least two entities which can be called, in Sanskrit, they had very clear ideas. In the language, you find Atman, which is self, and Aham, which is I. And whatever happens in consciousness needs these two poles. If you start thinking that consciousness is a sort of brick that we have in our brain, as the positivist school thought, and as even today is thought by many neuroscientists, well, you don't go very far. So I don't think science is in itself the solution. Thought is the solution.
No, I would like to move on because we have a line that's forming there. So can we hear from, not the gentleman, there's two young ladies in line before you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Calasso. In your talk, you touched on the nefarious political implications of the secularization trend. I wonder whether there might be positives as regards an artistic tradition. So I'm thinking particularly of how tragedy, or the artistic tradition for tragedy, comes out when there is a rejection of the gods or trend towards more secular beliefs.
I'm not sure I have got the point.
I was wondering whether how do you think the secularization of society impacts the arts and the creation of arts in those societies?
Oh, big question, boss. You know, you can have everything. You can have Kafka and you can have rubbish at the same time. I mean, it's not, secular society does not stop anybody from thinking, not for inventing things. But I haven't got your point on tragedy. What is the point?
I'm thinking Greek tragedy and Shakespeare both rely very heavily on the gods not being able to fully intervene. And the tension between the divine and the absence of the divine is sort of where the dilemmas arise.
Well, I'm not sure it is like that. Greek tragedy takes into account the gods in every moment. And so...
But they are no longer absolute benevolent gods.
They
don't always intervene when they're needed.
Well, I think that is... And Shakespeare, well, it's a long story, but... I mean, without these actors on the scene, which are the gods or the demons or the ghosts too, nothing much happens. And certainly in Greek tragedy, they say nothing happens without a god. It's not me, it's Sophocles. And Shakespeare, well, you know, it would be a long story to get into it, but something similar applies. What is true is that the structure of what was called tragedy in Greece cannot be repeated. That is, you know, Napoleon wanted writers to write tragedies. He asked that, but to no result. It was impossible, and nobody has managed, even under the sort of command of a dictator. So I think we have to forget about that.
Thank you, Mr. Calasso. There was a comment that you made about how can someone trained not to recognize the invisible? And I was extending that. How can someone trained not to recognize the invisible be capable even of accepting any kind of mystery, be capable of faith even in a principle in a secular context, or of trust, because there's something mysterious about a relationship based on trust as well. And it also seems to me essential for the way a society works. And then maybe this is unconnected, maybe it's connected, but since you mentioned Simone Weil, I was wondering what you thought of the solution she proposes in The Need for Roots, that a society should be rooted in the supernatural.
Well, I have to say I have not only an admiration, something more for Simone Weil. I think if I have to give something useful, helpful to read to someone who needs it, I would give him her books. And she's a good example of what I was trying to say. But the point of roots, the point of l'enracinement, I'm afraid is for me the weakest point in Simone Weil. Weakest when she tried, because in the very last months of her life, she wanted to find a sort of common ground on which to construct something. She tried to write a sort of new constitution, which should be, a sort of point of reference. And what he wrote on l'enracinement was in the same direction, and it's highly, highly important and interesting, but it is not at the same level of clairvoyance of what you read in the cahier, which is a real core of her thought. And an essential point is the relation to the past. In that sense, she's very strong. L'enracinement means that if you take away from a person the notion of the past, you kill him. That is essential. And that is what is happening today, every day. Not only for certain nations, for everybody. There is a sort of procedure of cutting out the past, which is one of the most terrifying aspects of what we are going through. And she perceived it in a totally different period. Imagine that was in the middle of the Second World War. And this phenomenon was not so obvious at that time. But now it is. So the amount of information we get is in relation to the amount of distraction of memory that we have. They are, the two plates of the... And it goes on. It goes on. And of course, one should simply look at it, how it works. But in any case, whatever she wrote is good to read.
Hi, thank you so much, Mr. Calasso. You mentioned Emile Durkheim, who asserts that society is God, in effect conveying that our notions of God and morality are, in effect, reflections of ourselves and of society. In his Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche presents a complementary framework to sort of trace the origin of morality to historical and even linguistic motifs. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the kind of compatibility and differences between these two approaches.
If I understand well, you are asking about the genealogy of morals of Nietzsche, right, in relation to?
In relation to Durkheim's assertion that society is God.
They're totally divergent, totally divergent. No, Nietzsche, Nietzsche is the axis of whatever we think now, to believe it or not. In The Man Without Qualities, there is a marvelous character called Clarisse, who would like to start a Nietzsche year instead of the celebrations for the Habsburg Empire. And I think it would be a very good thing for many of us to enter into that year. Because Nietzsche, even if you hate him, even if he says things which go totally against what you think, is one of those very rare thinkers to whom you have to react. It's impossible not to react to Nietzsche. You can read Kant and get bored and forget. But you cannot read Nietzsche and not react. So that is precious. And what is the direction in which he goes? He didn't know even himself. And he changed many times during his life. But surely not in the direction of Durkheim. He, first of all, the things we were talking about, these gods, demons, and powers, were very much present in his mind since the beginning, and up to the end. Durkheim is the maximum lucidity that you can have in a sort of Third Republic context of the positivism at the highest level. But he's precious for us for another reason, because we see what we lose if we follow that line, and we lose what is essential. So, no, I think they are going in two totally different directions. Although Nietzsche is not one direction, it's a plurality of directions. And if you read Menschliches als Menschliches, or you read Zarathustra, or you read Ex Homo, they are totally different lines. And that is part of his greatness. Durkheim is one line, very highly respectable, and he was a man of genius in a way, but it is one.
All right, so I see three more people lined up, so I think that we'll go through you three, and then we can call it an evening.
It will be short, I hope. I'm trying to digest the words superstition and sacrifice, and to get to the essence of those words and what it means for me and for you. And let us assume that we are a superstitious society, as you suggest. Then what does sacrifice mean to us? And reflecting on that, sacrifice, I believe as a society, as a superstitious society, maybe we have sacrificed our beliefs. But what have we gained? Maybe we wanted to gain freedom. Maybe we wanted to gain independence. And the true understanding of sacrifice, does it mean to gain something, or is it actually to surrender everything to a higher power, in which case we do not have a gain, we just have to surrender. We have to sacrifice without any gain. And I mean, as a society, maybe we have given up on that. We have sacrificed the sacrifice itself.
Yeah, you know, after many years, I have to say I came to the conclusion that if there is a subject which is the hardest you can conceive of, the most difficult and endless object of thought, it is what goes under the name sacrifice. So it's impossible to answer in a few words. But one point which is obvious to everybody, I think here and everywhere, is that on one hand, we have a society which has a certain horror of sacrifice. If someone tries to make a blood sacrifice in the middle of New York, the police comes, and it's right, I think, and stops him. At the same time, the word sacrifice is one of the most used and abused by politicians, economists, managers, whatever they do in their own field, they speak of sacrifice. And that goes unnoticed. That is the really paradoxical point. That if, I don't know, Mrs. Merkel or whoever says, well, such nation, well, Greece has to make some sacrifice. Nobody thinks of what is the history of the world and how in Greece itself it was developed the most complicated theory and practice of sacrifice, of which the tragedy, you know, the whole tragedy is only a commentary on sacrifice, the Greek tragedy. That's why today it's impossible. So you see, it is a subject where you cannot find limits anywhere. And so what does it mean today? I think the most sensible way would be to go back to what the people who have thought more and written more on sacrifice that's to say, the Vedic Indians, what they have said. There is a whole literary genre, the Brahmanas, which is the most unread part of the Veda, which is from beginning to end only on sacrifice. And there you find the most astounding theories, which in a way oblige you to work very carefully and cautiously through this labyrinth. But unfortunately, that genre, as I said, is the most unpopular one, even for scholars. There are lots of Indologists who avoid it and just skip it because it's, well, of course it's difficult, but it is difficult as the Ethica of Spinoza is difficult. That is the only way for getting to certain things. So I'm not sure I'm able to respond to what was the question, but the point is that in our world, either we manage to avoid the word sacrifice totally and condemn it as something which belongs to a very obscure past, or we should think about it. And thinking about it means a long way, a very, very long way. And that is not what is happening today, I think. So there is at the same time an attraction and a repulsion towards the phenomenon, which is in itself a real conundrum, because the essential point of sacrifice is distraction. The fact that in order to get in touch with a certain entity, whatever it is, divine or demonic or whatever, you have to distract something, to destroy something. That is essential point. And there's a Sanskrit word, tyaga, which means to cede, to renounce to a certain thing, which means that you lose that thing. And that is the key point on which everything turns. But it would take too much time, I think, if we go on.
The societal seems to apparently in some ways stand in opposition to the natural. But you can at the same time make characterizations of the society as organic. And I was wondering if you had anything to say regarding ecological and environmental crisis as a threat to society itself, and perhaps society's awareness or lack of awareness as perhaps a kind of sacrifice of the earth, a self-inflicted sort of phenomenon. I mean, the political and the scientific are, I think.
I'm afraid I'm not following very well.
I'm wondering if you can say anything about environmental or ecological crisis and sacrifice of the earth, sort of.
Look, ecology was. I don't want to insist too much on this point, but I think it has been for a long time a good excuse for not thinking. People felt that they were on the right path when they said, I have an ecological attitude. And they stopped there. So that was, of course I agree with what ecology is in itself something one shouldn't even mention in terms of thought, because it's part of good manners. And good manners are essential, of course. But if you think that you have stopped thinking, once you have ascertained that you cannot spit on the ground when you walk, and that is rather sort of doubtful for me. I mean, that is, and lots of people stop there, I think. And so I am terribly suspicious when I see putting themes in the first, or at the first level as the most important ones. Of course they are important, but one should mix them with many other things. And I'm afraid in the States there has been this tendency for a while, and maybe it's changing, but what I'm saying is that it is not enough to have good feelings towards the earth, towards the food, towards everything. Good feelings are not enough, and they are not particularly good very often.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. It was really thought-provoking. I'm still working on digesting many of the ideas that you said. I guess I was wondering, imagine if it turns out that you're wrong about pretty much everything. What do you think would be true instead? Like, what's like the sort of the second best?
I haven't got the point. Cosa ha detto?
There's always a chance.
Sì. That's very good. That's a good joke. Well, you can feel relieved. You go happy at home. And so you know what not to think, and that's already a good result. Well, it doesn't happen so often. It doesn't happen so often. Usually, well, it's a mixture, a bit of that, this and that. So I'm glad to have contributed to your relief. Thank you to you.
I'd like to thank our guest again, Roberto Calasso. And thank you all for coming. The René Girard lecture series will continue next year with another speaker, so stay tuned.